I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's so great to have so many industry and policy leaders joining us today for this timely conversation. Before we get started, I wanted to just introduce myself. My name is Kevin Wenzel. I'm the Director of Global Programming for Concordia. And I wanted to ground our discussion today in Concordia's mission of strengthening and supporting the partnering ecosystem. Now is a critical time for cross-sector collaboration, public-private partnerships, and a unified world. And that's why Concordia is reaffirming its unwavering commitment to maintaining its position as the leading nonpartisan convener alongside the UN General Assembly. And while the unprecedented nature of the virus is calling for a temporary increase in physical distance, it doesn't mean we can't still come together. This virtual discussion is on the role of partnerships on the front lines of global response to this pandemic and is designed for our member community, especially those building partnership-based interventions to support local, national, and global health and economic responses in the wake of COVID-19. Concordia's Department of Partnership Development is ready to support the formation and structure of new local and global initiatives, contributing to the response through impactful and transformational partnerships, including with the upcoming launch of Concordia's Crisis Action Alliance. I encourage you to interact with myself or Hannah Dalmet, Concordia's Director of Partnership Development, if you have any opportunities that you'd like to discuss with us. Concordia is a membership-based organization. If you were invited to this program by Concordia or Secretary Johnson due to the relevancy of your work on this topic, welcome. I encourage you to consider Concordia membership and be a part of this global partnership-based transformation. Before we begin, a few Zoom housekeeping rules, as we all are getting used to Zoom being part of our lives. All attendees are automatically muted on entry. If you would like to ask questions during the Q&A, you can do so using the feature, and you can also upvote other questions throughout the discussion. We'll be answering these at the end of the session. We'll also be monitoring the chat feature, which we encourage you to use throughout. The webinar is also being recorded and will be accessible via the Concordia website for future viewing. The Q&A will not be recorded, as it's a private conversation meant for our members. And finally, I'd like to thank and welcome Concordia Leadership Council member and former Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, and his team for partnering with Concordia for this webinar. In addition, I'd like to welcome our fellow speakers, His Excellency Bernard Cazeneuve, the former Prime Minister and Minister of the Interior of France, and the Honorable Angelino Alfano, former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Italy, as well as our moderator for this discussion, political strategist and analyst, Susan Del Percio. Susan, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for all attending this webinar. We'll get off right away because we don't have that much time. Minister Alfano, I'll start with you. Most of the West didn't really understand the impact of the coronavirus until we saw what was happening in Italy. You were the first country to see tremendous death and experience this immediately. I wonder if you felt that twofold. One, your country was prepared for this as much as it could be, and two, was the rest of the EU community ready to help out?
Thank you so much, Madame Del Percio, and thank you to Concordia for the occasion that this institution gave me to attend to this webinar. So Italy is part of a global context. Italy was found at this dramatic appointment with history, just like the rest of the world. My first consideration is that the world already knew that there was a risk of a pandemic. Analysts and scholars had talked about it for years. On the television platforms, you can even find TV series about the pandemic, and Bill Gates himself had talked about it a few years ago. Despite all this, the world has found itself unprepared for pandemic risk. The world has prepared itself for the threat of bioterrorism, with accurate security plans and strategies, but has not equipped itself to react promptly and effectively to the pandemic. Yet it should have done it. The first lesson I draw from all of this is that we should take the analysis of scholars more seriously and not catalog those of risk as a school hypothesis good for nice scientific publications, but something that will concern others, perhaps future generation, but not us. History teaches us that wars and pandemics are recurrent. Today's world reminds us that all of this is true. Northern Italy was and is strongly affected. North is the richest and most productive part of the country, as well as the one with the most advanced and efficient healthcare system in Italy. Without this extraordinary healthcare system, without this brilliant partnership, public and private partnership, I believe that consequences would have been much heavier. Madame Del Persio, it is not easy to say what could have been done more and better because it was not easy to become aware of the seriousness of the situation, its intensity and its duration. A small example of what I say. When the virus began to spread in Milan, a partial lockdown was decided. And after a few days, most of the citizens, entrepreneurs, even representatives of the institutions asked to resume activities and start again a normal life by launching the slogan, the motto, Milan doesn't stop, followed by other cities. Rome doesn't stop. Venice doesn't stop. Florence doesn't stop with videos and many flags. Milan doesn't stop. Well, after a few days, contrary to the restart, the lockdown has become total. And so the optimism of the will has been defeated by a dramatic reality. The so-called phase 2 began 2 days ago, that of living with the virus. Only time will tell us how much the coexistence is possible and how it is possible. But let me now to share with two dear friends, Jay Johnson and Bernard Cazeneuve. First of all, thank you, Jay, for the occasion and for the invitation. But let me share with them and with all of you some little lessons that I learned in 2.5 months, because we learned many things. That therapies are effective if they are timely. That the first therapies should be done at home. That the patient must arrive at the hospital when his condition has not yet worsened, and that is decisive for his survival. On the other field, we have learned that our freedoms are at risk not only if a dictatorship arrives, but also if a pandemic and untreated virus arrives. We have learned that in modern democracies, there is a great question concerning the means, the tools through which legitimate power can compress or even suspend fundamental freedoms, and that there is a very delicate issue regarding parliamentary control over those who have this enormous power. From the suffering of our entrepreneurs, from the tears of those who have lost their jobs, we have learned that the right to health can be in contrast with the economic security, and that the most dramatic and tiring task of politics is to reconcile these two sacred rights.
Prime Minister, if I may just, Minister rather, if I just want to interrupt, because that's such an important point that you touch on, is how the government chooses to move forward and operate. And I would like to just bring in Prime Minister Casino into this conversation as far as how you see reopening will work, not just in France, where we just heard there is a kind of perimeter that people will not be able to expand or leave from, but also when it comes to the EU and the quote opening up of not just France, but the EU as a whole. Yesterday or the day before, we heard in the United States, it very pointedly put out that we will have to decide if we want, how much we want to reopen versus how much we want to save lives. And that goes to the issue of the economy. I'd like to get your take, Prime Minister, on how we take next steps and the importance of the government's relationship with business and how they go forward together.
Key question you asked me, and I would like perhaps to begin with to explain what is the situation in France in regards of the pandemic. First of all, we have more than 25,000 people who died in France since mid-February. So it's a very high level of people who died because of this pandemic. And we have 115,000 people who were ill during this period. So it's a high level of people died in regards of the level of people who were ill during the last few weeks. During this period, the government had to face a very unprecedented situation. And for my own part, because I was confronted to a very hard situation when I was in office, I've decided to support the French authorities and to try to do my best when I had the opportunity to speak, to explain the situation we were confronted to, and to try to preserve the unity of the nation, because the unity of the nation is one of the way of overcoming together and very quickly the situation we are confronted to. President Macron very quickly decided to organize a lockdown with a high level of explanation of the situation and of the decision it took in front of the French people. The lockdown was decided at the middle of last month. A scientific council was created to advise public decision makers, and the government decided at this moment to organize transportation, teleworking, and took all kinds of decisions. I am not going to explain this decision because they are the same in every country. And what is, I think, interesting is to try to explain what we decided to do in France and with European institutions in order to help the businesses and the companies to face very serious economical crisis. And it's your question. In order to deal with the economical situation and the economic crisis, the government very quickly has set up support mechanisms for companies, creation of solidarity fund for small businesses, deferral of social and fiscal charges, postponement of the payment of rents, water, energy bills for small businesses, enhanced capacity of the Public Investment Bank to grant guarantees. Labor law has been adapted to the situation, and finally the state committed in the limit of 300 billion euros to guarantee bank lines of credit that businesses may need as a result of the pandemic. And all those measures was decided by the French government very quickly, with a permanent contact with French businesses and companies in order to be sure that all the process which was decided by the government will be in situation of being implemented very quickly in our countries. And we also try in Europe, and Angelino remember how hard it is in Europe to find a way of deciding very quickly when the situation is a tough situation, but we succeed taking in Europe a certain number of very important decisions. And I would like to speak in a few words about those decisions because they were supporting the efforts we have decided to do in France. First of all, it was very difficult in Europe to take common decisions concerning the health sector, because the health sector is a reserve competence of the states, and there is no capability of the European institutions to intervene in these matters very easily. But we have done our best together to try to intervene on the economic tools in order to be efficient. What were those decisions? In April, the Commission and the European Council published a document in order to organize the sharing of information between the European nations in regard of the situation they were confronted to. We also decided in April to endorse a 540 billion euro package of 3 safety nets for workers, businesses, and member states. And they also agreed to work together in order to establish a recovery fund for the future. I think that the recovery fund will be in situation of intervening in the next few weeks, and it's a new tool for the European institution in order to support the businesses and the companies in very
Prime Minister, I'd just like to interrupt you right here because I think it's a great segue to what Secretary Johnson has been doing here in the United States and his newly appointed position to the task force to reopening the Northeast of this country, which includes 7 states, of which is New York. And I would argue, not just as a New Yorker, but until New York is open, I don't think this country is open. But Secretary Johnson, taking your role in this task force, one of the things that seems as a stark difference versus Italy and France is that the United States, the federal government, has laid this to the states to manage. And I'm curious how the working of different states and different governors, who are always the most important person in their state, how you're working together, but also bringing in private industry, because as we know, President Trump has not really chosen to enforce certain laws that would allow us to act to respond as a national response, but rather putting the onus on the states.
Thank you, Susan. First of all, I want to thank my good friends and former colleagues, Angelino Alfano and Bernard Cazenove, the former interior ministers of Italy and France, respectively, while I served as Secretary of Homeland Security. Angelino, of course, went on to be the foreign minister of Italy, and Bernard went on to be the prime minister of France. Thank you for participating with us here today. Thank you also for doing this in English, which is not your primary language. We appreciate it, and all of those listening in this program appreciate it. So in answer to Susan's question, what is perhaps different here in the United States from France and Italy is that the power to quarantine, to require people to stay in their homes and to stay away from their places of business, resides at the state level, not at the national level. And so deciding when people should be allowed to go back to work and for our economy to turn back on again is largely a matter for state governors, not the United States president, President Trump. Because in our country, the police power, the public health power resides at the state level. It does not reside at the national level. Notwithstanding that, those of us here in the northeastern part of our country recognize that how and when to reopen our economy should be an interlocking decision between certain states. So I live in the state of New Jersey, but I work in the state of New York, just across the river, just 10 miles away. And how and when we reopen all of this depends upon the situation in New York, it depends upon the situation in New Jersey, but it also depends upon the public transportation situation between our two states. When I go to work every day, I ride public transportation, so one has to work in concert with the other. And so the governors of 7 states here in the Northeast have come together to form this working group that I am part of to advise them on how and when to reopen our economy. And this is probably one of the most difficult decisions any public servant can make, because it will not be a risk-free proposition as it is in your countries. The virus will still be with us when we decide to go back to work. And so we have to balance the risk of the public health versus the damage that is being done to our economy by continuing to have this shutdown. And so we're developing measurements, metrics for when we think the public health environment will be safe enough that we can leave our homes and go back to work. And that is a very, very difficult balance, and it's a very, very difficult decision right now. Over, Susan.
Okay, I'm going to open this up to all of you. You may have different takes on it, but I'll just kind of move you all into the conversation. Starting off with you, Minister Alfano. On Monday, there was a global summit, if you will, of international leaders to search for a cure, a vaccine for coronavirus. Absent was the United States. And it will not be the first time during this pandemic that we have said that the United States has not been a global leader. I am interested on your take as to how that affects the rest of the world and how they look to the United States and also look as far as working together. Is it truly America first means America alone?
So I think, first of all, that it is rational and convenient to work together to share research studies and experiments instead of working alone, each one for himself. And I like to reaffirm my vision about the main role that the US has to play in this very delicate contest, because so I chair a foundation with the name of Alcide De Gasperi in Italy, which was in Italy the founder of the transatlantic relationship between Italy, Europe, and US. And so I have a deep faith about the historical role of the United States. This is my specific vision about the role for the present and for the future of the United States. If we think in the absence of vaccine of the COVID-19 treatment methods, we have to reaffirm that it is essential to share the best practice and compare the result of each therapy used in each country to evaluate together which is the most effective for fighting the virus. And I think that is not a genial idea from me, but I think that is a common sense. And so I consider that a peer relationship between states is very, very important. But at the same time, this is an historical moment to relaunch international cooperation. And a great alliance between the states that want to progress together. I consider that multilateralism is under attack.
Thank you.
And it's crucial.
Move it along to Prime Minister Cassano and get your opinion on where we're moving, not just as the United States, whether they're a strong enough leader or not, but where we're moving somewhere between this reopening of the globe, if you will, and the new normal. How can we find ways to collaborate together across our nations, especially not just on a cure, but on allowing travel, allowing borders to open, etc.?
First of all, I would like to say several words about the situation between the nation and the future of multilateralism. Without multilateralism, we will be unable to face the main problems we are confronted to. And when I see what happens within the United Nations during the last few weeks, within kind of incapability to find a common way of overcoming all the problems, when, for example, the Secretary General tried to organize a ceasefire amid COVID-19, he was unable to find strong support among the main nations to reach the goal. And when we have decided to organize a way to reinforce the cooperation between the nations in order to be more efficient together in front of the pandemic, we were unable to find a majority, not in the General Assembly, but in the Security Council. So we have to be aware that we should be confronted to more and more problems if we are unable to find the way of deepening our cooperation concerning the main problems, climate change, pandemic, and all the problems we are confronted to. And we shall be unable to do that if the United States don't decide in the future to go on being kind of leader of the world, but in relationship with all their environment. So that's the first point. Concerning the way of coming back in normal life by reopening the border, organizing new travel between the nations, I think that it will be impossible to come back to normal life if we understand coming back to normal life as coming back to the world which exists before the crisis. And I think that we shall have to be able to imagine a new world concerning all kinds of problems we were unable to overcome during the past. Climate change, with the decision taken by a certain number of nations concerning the roadmap we have decided to implement together after the Conference of Paris in 2015. And we shall have also to imagine a new commercial relationships between the nation in order to be sure that nationalism, economic nationalism, will not be a problem if we want to reach the goal of climate change. We shall have also to organize a more integrated vision within Europe and to imagine a new relationship between Europe and the United States about all kinds of problems. That's the problems we have in front of us, and we shall have to find the key for each problem I spoke about.
So, Prime Minister, I'm going to bring it over to Secretary Johnson, who I'm sure has the key to fixing all of these problems, but is going to save that for a moment. And actually, I want to go to something the Prime Minister brought up. We're about to celebrate the UN's 75th anniversary. And we have seen the last 3.5 years where the United States has not been a leader in the UN. It's still a participant. It still pays its dues, but it doesn't take an aggressive role in establishing protocols in international, whether it's the economies that we're all going to come up with or the health concerns. How does the United States fight this battle at home, but also begin to lead at an international level?
Susan, the best parallel I can think of is the Ebola crisis in 2014. Now, the Ebola crisis is fundamentally different from the COVID-19 crisis. It had nowhere near the impact that COVID has had here in the United States, but the world stamped out the virus in West Africa in 2014 through an international effort. And I'd like to think that in that crisis, the United States helped lead the international community by sending our military to West Africa, by sending our health officials, our health experts to West Africa, along with other nations, including European nations, to stamp out the virus at the source. There was a good deal of anxiety and panic, as you know, here in this country 5 years ago when the Ebola crisis hit, but we took part in an international effort to stamp out the virus. I regret that the dynamic is very different here, not just for political reasons. I was just looking at the numbers of cases. In Italy, it's 213,000. In France, it's 168,000. In New York State alone, which is just one of our 50 states, Bernard and Angelino, the number of cases is 330,000, which is almost the equivalent of your two countries combined. And so the United States itself is very much under siege right now. We have 1/3 of all the cases in the world. And I regret to predict that in the immediate aftermath of this crisis, there will be a mood in this country to turn inward in terms of resource sharing and the like in dealing with problems like this. Perhaps, Susan, you have a different view, but that's my assessment.
No, I actually share a very similar view. We have covered so much here, and I am sure that it has raised a lot of questions from the audience. So I'm going to hand it over to Kevin, who will be handling the Q&A portion.